Have you ever wondered how a single vision can transform not just one life, but the spiritual landscape of entire civilizations? In the hills of medieval Spain, a man was born who would change the way millions approach prayer, contemplation, and the pursuit of truth. Saint Dominic of Guzmán, preacher, mystic, founder of one of the Church's most influential orders, didn't just establish communities or write treatises. He developed a complete philosophy of life that balanced rigorous intellectual pursuit with profound mystical devotion, active preaching with contemplative prayer, and unwavering truth with boundless mercy. Tonight, we're going to explore the entire philosophical vision of this remarkable saint, discovering why his approach to faith, reason, and spiritual warfare remains as relevant today as it was 800 years ago. If these explorations resonate with you, I'd be grateful for a like or perhaps a subscription. It truly makes a bigger impact than you might realize. I'm always fascinated to know, where in the world are you listening from right now? Share your city and the current time in the comments below. There's something special about our global community gathering together through these quiet philosophical journeys. Now, get comfortable. Lower those lights if you can. Perhaps let some gentle ambient sound fill the space around you, and let's settle into tonight's exploration together. We're going to discover why Dominic's philosophy wasn't built on abstract speculation, but on concrete action. Why he believed that truth must be lived, not merely studied, and why the path to God required both the mind's sharpest reasoning and the heart's deepest love. Part 1. The Formation of a Philosophical Vision. The story begins in 1170 in the Castilian village of Caleruega, where a child was born into a world of profound intellectual and spiritual ferment. This was the High Middle Ages, when Europe was awakening to new possibilities. Universities were being founded. Classical texts were being rediscovered through Arabic translations. Gothic cathedrals were reaching toward heaven, and the entire structure of human knowledge was being reorganized. The 12th century marked one of history's great renaissances, a period when the West was recovering its intellectual confidence after centuries of relative isolation. But it was also a time of profound crisis. Heresies were spreading rapidly, challenging the foundations of Christian orthodoxy. The Albigensian movement in southern France was attracting thousands with its dualistic teachings that matter was evil and only spirit was good. The Waldensians preached against church hierarchy and sacraments. Various millennial movements predicted the imminent end of the world. The intellectual coherence of Christendom was fragmenting, and the Church seemed unable to respond effectively to these challenges. Dominic de Guzmán was born into a noble family, but his parents, Felix and Juana de Aza, were distinguished not by their titles, but by their deep Christian commitment and extraordinary charity. The family belonged to the minor nobility of Castile, with enough status to provide their children with education, but not so much wealth that they were insulated from the suffering of ordinary people. This position, socially elevated enough to access learning, but close enough to common life to feel its struggles, would shape Dominic's entire approach to ministry. The stories surrounding Dominic's birth already hint at the philosophical destiny awaiting him. His mother, Juana, reportedly had a vision before his birth. She saw a dog carrying a torch in its mouth, running across the world and setting it aflame. The symbolism would prove prophetic. Dominic would indeed become the watchdog of the Lord, a play on his name in Latin, Dominicanus, carrying the flame of truth to illuminate a darkening world. This imagery wasn't mere pious legend, but captured something essential about Dominic's mission. He would be both guardian of orthodoxy and bearer of enlightenment. From his earliest years, Dominic exhibited characteristics that would define his mature philosophy. He wasn't content with superficial piety or mere emotional devotion. Even as a child, he showed a hunger for understanding, a need to know not just what to believe, but why. While other children played games, young Dominic was found in the family chapel, not just reciting prayers mechanically, but appearing to wrestle with their meaning. His questions to his parents and his uncle often went beyond simple catechism responses. He wanted to understand the logic of faith, the reasons behind religious practices, the connections between different doctrines. This intellectual intensity wasn't cold rationalism. Stories from his childhood emphasize that his pursuit of understanding was always connected to compassion. When he learned about the sufferings of Christ, he wept. When he heard about the fate of souls separated from God, he became distressed. His thinking and feeling weren't separate faculties, but deeply integrated dimensions of a single consciousness seeking to understand and respond to ultimate reality. His uncle, the archpriest of Gumiel de Izan, recognized this unusual combination of intellectual hunger and emotional depth. He provided Dominic with his first formal education, grounding him in grammar, logic, and the foundations of theological reasoning. But more importantly, he modeled an approach to learning that was both rigorous and devotional, both intellectually demanding and spiritually formative. The uncle understood something crucial, that education isn't just information transfer, but character formation, that studying truth properly transforms the student as much as it informs them. At 14, Dominic was sent to the prestigious studium in Palencia, one of the foremost centers of learning in medieval Europe. Palencia was attempting to become a rival to the great universities of Paris and Bologna, attracting renowned scholars and offering advanced instruction in both secular and sacred subjects. For 6 years, Dominic immersed himself in the liberal arts, the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, followed by the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These weren't merely technical skills, but were understood as disciplines that trained the mind in different modes of reasoning and prepared students for the higher study of theology. The medieval educational system was based on a sophisticated understanding of human development and the structure of knowledge. The liberal arts were called liberal because they were fitting for free persons. They liberated the mind from ignorance and confusion, training it to think clearly about different kinds of questions. Grammar taught precision in language and careful attention to meaning. Logic taught rigorous reasoning and the ability to identify fallacies. Rhetoric taught effective communication and the art of persuasion. The mathematical arts trained abstract thinking and showed how reason could discover necessary truths. This comprehensive formation produced minds capable of sophisticated thought across multiple domains. After mastering the liberal arts, Dominic spent 4 more years studying theology, mastering the scriptures, the church fathers, and the emerging scholastic method that was revolutionizing Christian thought. The scholastic method, pioneered by teachers like Peter Abelard and being perfected in Paris, applied logical analysis to theological questions, seeking to demonstrate the rationality of Christian doctrine and to resolve apparent contradictions through careful distinction and argument. This method would become central to Dominic's approach. The conviction that faith was supremely reasonable and that theological questions could be addressed with philosophical rigor. Here, we see the first principle of Dominic's philosophy taking shape. Truth requires disciplined study. He wasn't satisfied with vague spiritual feelings or inherited opinions. He wanted to understand the structure of reality, the nature of God, the foundations of moral obligation, the relationship between faith and reason. This commitment to rigorous intellectual formation would become central to the Dominican charism. The conviction that effective preaching requires deep knowledge, that defending the faith requires understanding not just what the church teaches, but why those teachings make philosophical and theological sense. But Dominic's philosophy was never purely intellectual, and his years at Palencia would demonstrate this in a dramatic way. During his student years, a terrible famine struck the region. Crop failures had created desperate scarcity, and people were literally dying of hunger in the streets. Students and townspeople alike faced starvation. The authorities seemed unable to respond adequately, and chaos threatened as desperate people resorted to theft and violence to feed their families. Dominic, surveying his precious collection of books, hand-copied manuscripts that represented years of work and enormous financial value, made a decision that revealed the second principle of his philosophy: truth must serve love. He sold all his books to buy food for the hungry. In the medieval economy, books were extraordinarily valuable. A single manuscript might cost as much as a small house. Dominic's collection represented not just his personal investment, but his professional future. These were the tools he'd need to become a successful teacher or administrator. Selling them was economic and professional suicide. When fellow students questioned this seemingly impractical act, pointing out that he'd need those books to complete his studies and build his career, Dominic's response was sharp and clear. How can I study from dead skins when living people are dying of hunger? The phrase dead skins referred to the parchment on which books were written, animal skins that had been processed and prepared for writing. Dominic's point was devastating. You're worried about dead animal skins, while actual human beings, made in God's image, are perishing? What kind of priorities are those? This wasn't sentimentalism or anti-intellectualism. Dominic wasn't saying that study was unimportant or that books had no value. He was making a more subtle philosophical point. Knowledge that doesn't lead to compassionate action is worthless. Truth and love aren't competing values, but complementary realities. The pursuit of understanding serves the deeper purpose of human flourishing. You study theology not to win arguments, but to save souls. You master philosophy not to display intellectual prowess, but to guide people toward genuine fulfillment. But there's an even deeper insight embedded in Dominic's action. He understood that knowledge isn't just information stored in the mind, but a relationship with reality that transforms the knower. If you truly understood theological truth, if you really grasped that every human being is made in God's image and destined for eternal communion with divine love, then you couldn't remain indifferent to human suffering. True knowledge necessarily issues in appropriate action. If your study doesn't make you more compassionate, more just, more engaged with human need, then you haven't really learned what you claim to know. This integration of intellect and charity, of rigorous study and practical compassion, would remain the hallmark of Dominic's thought throughout his life. He was laying the groundwork for a philosophical vision that refused to separate theory from practice, contemplation from action, or truth from love. This wasn't a compromise between competing values, but a recognition that authentic truth necessarily encompasses love, and genuine love necessarily seeks truth. The story doesn't end with the sacrifice. According to tradition, when Dominic offered to sell himself into slavery to ransom captives, another act of extreme charity, his offer was refused, but the gesture itself revealed the depths of his understanding of human dignity and divine love. He saw no fundamental difference between himself and those suffering. The accidents of birth and circumstance that had given him education and opportunity rather than slavery and suffering were just that, accidents. In terms of fundamental worth and dignity, he and the captives were equals, both made in God's image, both destined for the same divine fellowship. This philosophical anthropology, this understanding of the human person, would shape everything Dominic would later teach and do. Part 2. The Crisis of Truth. At 25, having completed his studies at Palencia with distinction, Dominic joined the cathedral chapter at Osma under Bishop Diego de Acevedo. This was a significant decision that revealed his priorities. He could have pursued an academic career, teaching at Palencia, or seeking a position at one of the emerging universities. His intellectual gifts would have made him successful in this path. Alternatively, he could have sought advancement in church administration, using his family connections to secure a bishopric or other position of influence. Many talented young clerics chose this route to power and prestige. Instead, Dominic chose to join a community of canons regular, priests living under a common rule, following the rule of St. Augustine. This choice indicated his conviction that the Christian life required community, that intellectual and spiritual formation happened best in structured common life, rather than in isolation or in the competitive atmosphere of academic or ecclesiastical careerism. He was embracing the Augustinian rule, and this was significant for his philosophical development. Augustine had insisted on the compatibility of faith and reason, had developed sophisticated arguments for the existence of God and the rationality of Christian belief, and had demonstrated how classical philosophy could be baptized and put in service of Christian truth. Augustine's Confessions showed how philosophical questioning could lead to faith, how reason could identify its own limits and recognize its need for divine illumination, and how intellectual life could be integrated with devotional practice. Dominic absorbed this Augustinian confidence in reason's ability to discover truth when properly directed, while also recognizing reason's need for grace and revelation. Life in the chapter at Osma was structured around the rhythms of liturgical prayer, scriptural study, and contemplative reflection. The canons gathered 7 times daily for the divine office: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, and vespers, sanctifying the hours through communal prayer. Between these liturgical celebrations, they studied scripture and theology, managed the cathedral's affairs, and served the spiritual needs of the diocese. This rhythm of prayer and study, of contemplation and administration, provided Dominic with a model for integrating different aspects of Christian life. Dominic distinguished himself by his extraordinary devotion, spending whole nights in prayer, often weeping for the salvation of sinners, practicing severe austerities. His fellow canons noticed that he rarely slept in his bed, preferring to pray through much of the night, or to rest briefly on the hard chapel floor. They observed his tears during the reading of the gospel, his visible emotion when meditating on Christ's passion, his intense concern for anyone who was struggling with sin or doubt. But again, his piety wasn't divorced from intellectual activity. The medieval understanding of contemplation, which Dominic embraced fully, wasn't passive emotional experience, but active intellectual engagement with divine truth. To contemplate meant to think deeply about God, to use reason illuminated by faith to penetrate the mysteries of revelation, to seek understanding of what was believed. The great motto of medieval theology was faith-seeking understanding, not blind acceptance, but reasoned exploration of the content of faith. Dominic's contemplation focused particularly on two themes that would shape his entire ministry. First was the mystery of divine love manifested in the incarnation and passion of Christ. He would meditate for hours on the gospel accounts of Jesus' suffering, trying to fathom the depths of love that would lead God to accept such humiliation and pain for the sake of human salvation. This wasn't sentimental devotion, but philosophical and theological reflection on the most profound mystery: how infinite divine love relates to finite human suffering, how justice and mercy are reconciled in the cross, how God's transcendence is compatible with intimate involvement in human history. The second focus was the fate of souls separated from God through sin and error. Dominic would reportedly cry out through the night, "Lord, what will become of sinners?" This question wasn't just emotional anguish, but philosophical and theological perplexity. How could a loving God allow souls to be lost eternally? What was the relationship between human freedom, divine grace, and final salvation or damnation? How should those who knew the truth respond to those trapped in error? With coercion, with indifference, with patient persuasion? These weren't abstract problems, but urgent questions about real people and real souls. And Dominic wrestled with them, not just intellectually, but with his entire being. The decisive moment in Dominic's philosophical development came around 1203, when he accompanied Bishop Diego on a diplomatic mission to Denmark. King Alfonso VIII of Castile had charged Bishop Diego with negotiating a marriage alliance, and Diego chose Dominic as his travel companion, recognizing his intellectual gifts and spiritual maturity. The journey would take them through southern France, and what Dominic encountered there would transform his understanding of the Church's mission and his own calling. In the towns and villages of Languedoc and Provence, Dominic encountered the Albigensian heresy firsthand, and the experience was shocking. This wasn't a theoretical problem read about in books, but a massive spiritual catastrophe unfolding across an entire region. Whole villages had converted to Catharism. Catholic churches stood empty, while Cathar preachers attracted huge crowds. The social fabric was tearing apart as families divided along religious lines, with Catholic parents disowning Cathar children and vice versa. The Albigensians, also called Cathars, from the Greek word for pure, taught a radical dualism derived ultimately from ancient Manichaeism and Gnosticism. Their core conviction was that there were two ultimate principles, or gods: a good God who created the spiritual realm, and an evil God, sometimes identified with the God of the Old Testament, who created the material world. All matter was inherently evil, a prison for spirits who'd fallen from the purely spiritual realm. The goal of life was to escape from material existence through gnosis, special knowledge, and extreme asceticism. This fundamental dualism generated a whole system of beliefs and practices that contradicted Catholic Christianity at almost every point. The Cathars rejected the Incarnation. How could the good God take on evil matter in becoming human? They rejected the sacraments. How could material things like water, bread, and wine convey spiritual grace? They rejected the resurrection of the body. Why would anyone want their evil material body back? They rejected marriage and procreation. Why perpetuate the imprisonment of spirits in matter? They developed their own hierarchy of perfect ones, perfecti, who lived in extreme asceticism, abstaining from meat, from sexual relations, and from most material comforts, while ordinary believers, credentes, lived normally until they received the consolamentum, a kind of Cathar baptism, on their deathbeds. What made the heresy particularly attractive was its apparent moral superiority. The Cathar perfecti genuinely lived simply and ascetically, in stark contrast to many Catholic clergy who lived in luxury, accumulated wealth, and were often guilty of simony, nepotism, and sexual immorality. When ordinary people compared the lifestyle of Cathar preachers with that of Catholic bishops and priests, the Cathars seemed more authentically Christian, more committed to the gospel's demands, more trustworthy as spiritual guides. The Catholic Church's initial response to the crisis had been to send papal legates with authority to preach and to coordinate efforts against the heresy. But these legates traveled in impressive retinues, with fine horses and expensive clothing, stayed in comfortable accommodations, and preached with great ceremony and emphasis on their official authority. The contrast with the simple Cathar preachers was devastating. The message was orthodox, but the messengers undermined it through the contradiction between their teaching and their lifestyle. Dominic's response to this crisis reveals the third principle of his philosophy. Error must be fought with truth, not with force, and truth must be embodied to be effective. He saw immediately that the Church's approach was failing because it relied on external authority and impressive display rather than on the intrinsic power of truth embodied in authentic witness. You can't convince people of truth through intimidation or impressive displays. Truth has its own authority, its own power to persuade, but only when it's presented with integrity by people whose lives embody what they teach. The incident at the inn in Toulouse became emblematic of Dominic's method. He and Diego were staying at an inn whose owner had converted to Catharism. Rather than simply denouncing the man's error or asserting church authority, Dominic spent the entire night in conversation with him, asking questions, listening carefully to the man's arguments, showing respect for his intelligence and sincerity even while firmly refuting his conclusions. Dominic deployed philosophical reasoning, scriptural arguments, appeals to tradition, and personal testimony, all woven together in a sustained dialogue that took seriously the innkeeper's doubts and objections. By dawn, the innkeeper had been reconverted to Catholic Christianity, not through intimidation or bribery, not through appeals to mere authority, but through patient reasoning and authentic witness. Dominic had demonstrated that truth could win in open debate, that Catholic teaching could withstand the most rigorous questioning, and that effective evangelization required meeting people where they were intellectually and spiritually. So Dominic proposed to Bishop Diego a radical change in missionary method. They would adopt evangelical poverty more extreme than the Cathar perfecti, traveling on foot without money or provisions, relying entirely on providence, begging for food when necessary, staying in humble accommodations, or even sleeping outdoors. They would engage the heretics, not through pronouncements backed by church authority, but through public debates, reasoned argument, patient explanation, and lived witness. They would demonstrate that Catholic teaching could withstand the most rigorous intellectual scrutiny, and that Catholic preachers could live with even greater dedication and purity than the heretics claimed for themselves. This approach was revolutionary and controversial. Many church authorities thought it was dangerous to give heretics a platform through public debates. Better to suppress them through authority and, if necessary, through force. Others thought that adopting such radical poverty would undermine the dignity of the church and its ministers. Still, others doubted whether intellectual arguments could counter a movement that seemed to be driven more by social resentment against church corruption than by careful theological reasoning. But Dominic had diagnosed the problem accurately. The crisis wasn't primarily political or even primarily moral, though both politics and morality were involved. It was fundamentally intellectual and spiritual. The Cathars had a coherent worldview that seemed to answer deep questions about the existence of evil, the purpose of material existence, and the path to salvation. Defeating this worldview required offering a better worldview, one that was philosophically more sophisticated, theologically more sound, and experientially more satisfying. And this better worldview had to be embodied in the lives of its proponents, not just asserted abstractly. The philosophical sophistication of Dominic's approach becomes clearer when we understand the nature of the intellectual challenge the Albigensians posed. Their dualism seemed to solve certain persistent philosophical problems elegantly. The problem of evil. How can evil exist in a world created by an all-good, all-powerful God? Had plagued Christian thinkers since Augustine. The Cathars had a simple answer. There are two gods, one good and one evil, and evil comes from the evil God's creation. The problem of the soul's origin. Does God create new souls for each person? Do souls pre-exist and enter bodies at conception? Are souls passed on from parents? Had generated endless debates. The Cathars, again, had a simple answer. Souls are eternal spirits that pre-exist and have fallen into material bodies. The problem of human psychology. Why do we experience ourselves as torn between spirit and flesh, between noble aspirations and base desires? Seemed particularly well explained by Cathar anthropology. You weren't an integrated whole, but a composite of opposed principles, a good spirit trapped in an evil body. Your experience of internal conflict wasn't a moral problem requiring discipline and grace, but an ontological reality reflecting the fundamental structure of existence. This explained why virtue was so difficult and why asceticism that denied the body seemed spiritually advanced. Dominic had to show that these apparently neat solutions actually created worse philosophical problems than they solved. If matter is inherently evil, then creation itself is evil, which means either God didn't create it, denying divine omnipotence, or God created evil, denying divine goodness. If matter is evil, then the incarnation is impossible or blasphemous. How could the good God unite with evil matter? And if the incarnation didn't really happen, then the entire gospel story is false or symbolic, which undermines Christianity's historical claims and makes salvation arbitrary. If the material world is evil, then why did Jesus eat, drink, and have physical relationships? Why would the New Testament celebrate the resurrection of the body? The Albigensian position, when examined carefully, was philosophically incoherent and contradicted the clear witness of Scripture. But Dominic didn't just point out logical contradictions. He offered a more compelling philosophical vision: the goodness of creation, the compatibility of matter and spirit, the possibility of matter serving as a vehicle for grace, the dignity of the human body, the sacramental principle that visible things can convey invisible realities. Drawing on the doctrine of the Incarnation, Dominic articulated what we might call a Christian humanism, an affirmation of the material world and embodied existence as fundamentally good, though fallen and needing redemption. This Christian humanism was philosophically richer and more life-affirming than Cathar dualism. It honored both the physical and spiritual dimensions of human existence without setting them in ultimate opposition. It explained evil not as a second ultimate principle, but as the privation or corruption of good, a subtle but crucial distinction. It made sense of why people experience beauty in nature, joy in physical pleasure, and meaning in embodied relationships, all of which the Cathar system had to dismiss as illusions or temptations. And it offered a more hopeful vision, not escape from material existence, but the transformation and redemption of the whole person, body, and soul together. Part 3. The birth of a method. The years Dominic spent debating the Albigensians, from roughly 1206 to 1215, were his philosophical laboratory. He was developing a method of engagement that would define the Dominican approach for centuries. This method had several key elements, each philosophically significant and pedagogically sophisticated. First, there was the commitment to public disputation as the primary mode of engagement with error. Dominic would announce that he was prepared to debate any Cathar leader who would meet him, and these debates would happen in public squares, markets, and churches, with crowds of ordinary people watching and listening. The debates followed structured formats. Each side would present arguments, respond to objections, and rebut the other's case. Sometimes these debates lasted for days, with breaks for meals and rest, and with the audience serving as judge of who'd made the better arguments. This democratic approach to truth was remarkable for its time. Dominic believed that ordinary people, when presented with clear arguments, could recognize truth for themselves. You didn't need to protect them from heretical ideas by censorship or coercion. You needed to present them with better arguments and trust their rational capacities. This was philosophical optimism, confidence in human reason's ability to recognize truth when it was properly presented. But this confidence wasn't naive. Dominic understood that people's judgments could be clouded by prejudice, self-interest, or inadequate information. He also understood that purely intellectual arguments weren't always sufficient because people are moved by more than logic. They're influenced by emotions, loyalties, habits, and the example of those they respect. This is why Dominic insisted that effective preaching required not just sound arguments, but credible witnesses whose lives embodied the truth they proclaimed. The famous incident at Fonjo illustrates both Dominic's commitment to public verification of truth and his confidence that truth would vindicate itself when genuinely tested. The Cathars, confident in their position, proposed that they put their arguments in writing and submit them to trial by fire, a common medieval practice for discerning divine judgment. Both sides would write down their best arguments, and both sets of writings would be thrown into flames. God would vindicate the true doctrine by preserving it while the false doctrine burned. According to tradition, when this test was conducted before a large crowd, the Cathar book burned immediately, while Dominic's manuscript emerged from the fire unscathed. Even more remarkably, the manuscript reportedly leaped from the flames 3 times, as if being expelled by the fire itself, finally landing on a wooden beam where it left scorch marks that were preserved for centuries as testimony to the miracle. The crowd, witnessing this clear sign of divine favor, recognized Catholic truth, and many Cathars converted on the spot. Modern readers might be skeptical about the literal historicity of this story. Trial by ordeal was based on assumptions about divine intervention that we no longer share. But whether the story is literally true or symbolically embellished, it captures something essential about Dominic's conviction. Truth doesn't need protection from scrutiny. When genuinely tested against error, truth will vindicate itself. You don't need to fear open examination or public debate. You need to welcome it, confident that truth has its own intrinsic authority that will become evident when it's compared directly with falsehood. This confidence had profound philosophical implications. It meant that faith wasn't fideism, belief without or against reason. It meant that Christian truth wasn't arbitrary divine command that could have been otherwise. It meant that revelation wasn't addition of information with no connection to what reason could discover. Rather, faith and reason were complementary, with revelation completing and perfecting what reason could begin to discover, and with reason helping to articulate, defend, and apply what revelation disclosed. This harmony between faith and reason would become a central Dominican conviction, eventually reaching its fullest expression in Thomas Aquinas' synthesis. Second, there was Dominic's insistence on meeting opponents where they were intellectually and culturally. He didn't just assert Catholic positions and demand assent. He learned the Cathar arguments in detail, understood their appeal, respected their internal logic, and then demonstrated where they failed when pushed to their logical conclusions or confronted with scriptural and experiential evidence. He took his opponents seriously as intelligent people who'd been led astray by incomplete reasoning or false premises, not as simply stupid or evil. This charitable intellectual engagement, assuming the best about your opponents while firmly refuting their errors, would become a hallmark of Dominican methodology. It reflected both philosophical sophistication and Christian charity. Philosophically, it recognized that few intellectual errors are simply arbitrary or willful. Most emerge from genuine puzzlement about difficult questions, from partial insights taken to extremes, or from conclusions that seem to follow logically from premises that aren't examined carefully enough. Understanding where someone went wrong requires reconstructing their reasoning sympathetically before showing where it fails. The charitable dimension was equally important. Dominic genuinely cared about the Cathars as persons, not just as representatives of erroneous positions to be defeated. He wanted their conversion, their salvation, their flourishing, not their humiliation or destruction. This meant treating them with respect, listening carefully to their concerns, acknowledging whatever truth their position contained, and only then showing where they'd gone astray. His tears at night for sinners weren't generic piety, but specific grief for particular people he'd debated during the day, people whose intelligence and sincerity he respected even while their errors distressed him. Third, Dominic developed what we might call a holistic apologetics that engaged the whole person: intellect, will, emotions, and imagination. He didn't rely only on logical arguments, though arguments were essential. He also deployed beauty through liturgical celebrations, devotion through the example of his own prayer life, practical wisdom through counseling those who sought his guidance, and community through establishing groups of converts who supported each other. The Catholic faith wasn't just more logically coherent than the Cathar alternative. It was more beautiful, more humanly fulfilling, more capable of sustaining genuine community and culture. This holistic approach is philosophically sophisticated because it recognizes that human knowing isn't purely rational. We know through our bodies, emotions, relationships, and aesthetic experiences, as well as through abstract reasoning. Aristotle had taught that knowledge begins in sense experience. Augustine had emphasized the role of love in knowing. We understand what we love. The medieval synthesis Dominic inherited understood that different dimensions of human existence contributed to knowledge, and that a truly persuasive philosophy of life must address all these dimensions. For instance, Dominic recognized that the Cathar rejection of matter and the body, however intellectually articulated, ran counter to immediate human experience. People naturally found joy in physical pleasures, the taste of food, the warmth of the sun, sexual union, the beauty of landscapes. They naturally formed attachments to material things and to other embodied persons. The Cathar system required constantly fighting against these natural responses, dismissing them as illusions or temptations. In contrast, Catholic sacramentalism affirmed these experiences while purifying and elevating them, showing how material things could mediate spiritual realities without themselves being ultimate. Fourth, and perhaps most important, Dominic insisted that the teacher's life must embody the truth being taught. This wasn't just a practical consideration about credibility, though credibility mattered enormously. It reflected a deep philosophical conviction about the nature of truth itself. Truth isn't just a set of correct propositions existing independently of persons. Truth is ultimately personal. It's Christ himself, the Logos, the divine word made flesh. And because truth is personal, it must be incarnated, embodied, lived in human existence. You can't effectively teach what you don't embody. This incarnational epistemology, the conviction that truth must be lived to be fully known and effectively communicated, runs throughout Dominic's philosophy. It explains why he insisted that preachers must be formed in community, practicing the virtues they would proclaim. It explains why study and prayer were equally essential in Dominican life. Study to understand truth intellectually, prayer to encounter truth personally and be transformed by it. It explains why the order would emphasize contemplation alongside action. Contemplation interiorizes truth, making it part of your being rather than just information you possess. The implications are profound. If truth must be embodied to be effective, then intellectual formation alone is insufficient. You can master theology, know all the arguments, understand every doctrine, and still fail as a preacher if your life contradicts what you teach. The disconnect between message and messenger doesn't just undermine credibility. It suggests that you haven't really understood what you claim to know. If you truly grasped that God is love, that all persons are made in the divine image, that we're called to lay down our lives for others, if you really understood these truths, then your life would necessarily reflect them. The failure to embody truth reveals incomplete understanding. This is why Dominic's first question when evaluating potential preachers wasn't, do they know the theology, but do they live it? Knowledge that doesn't transform the knower isn't real knowledge, but mere information. And information, however accurate, can't transform others because transformation happens through encounter with reality, not just with descriptions of reality. You encounter reality most powerfully in persons who embody it. Part 4. The Mystical Foundation. Dominic's philosophy can't be understood without attending to its mystical foundation. This might seem paradoxical. How can a thinker committed to reason, argument, and intellectual rigor also be a mystic? How can someone who established an order devoted to study also spend entire nights in ecstatic prayer? But the paradox resolves when we understand medieval epistemology correctly and recognize the philosophical sophistication of mystical theology. For medieval thinkers, building on Neoplatonic and Augustinian traditions, knowledge existed in a hierarchy. At the lowest level was sense knowledge, direct awareness of material things through sight, touch, taste, and the other senses. This provided immediate but limited knowledge of particular things. Above sense knowledge was intellectual knowledge, rational understanding of universal principles, logical relationships, mathematical truths. This provided more certain and comprehensive knowledge, but was still abstract, dealing with concepts rather than realities. But the highest form of knowledge wasn't achieved through either sensation or discursive reasoning. It was achieved through contemplation, a form of knowing that transcended both concepts and images to achieve direct awareness of ultimate reality. Contemplation wasn't irrational, but transrational. It presupposed and included the insights of reason, but went beyond them to direct intuitive grasp of truth. The philosophical basis for this hierarchy of knowledge was the recognition that ultimate reality, God, transcends all finite concepts and categories. Any description of God, however accurate, is inadequate because God is infinite while all human concepts are finite. So while reason can demonstrate God's existence and establish certain truths about divine nature, it can't comprehend God exhaustively or achieve the union with God that's the ultimate human fulfillment. For that, you need contemplation. Dominic was known for spending entire nights in prayer, often with tears streaming down his face, crying out, "Lord, what will become of sinners?" This wasn't just emotional piety or repetitive recitation of formulas. It was contemplative engagement with ultimate reality. Dominic was confronting the mystery of human freedom, divine justice, divine mercy, and the possibility of eternal damnation. He was wrestling with the hardest theological and philosophical questions, not just in his head, but with his whole being. Intellect, will, emotions, imagination, and that deepest center of consciousness where the human spirit encounters divine spirit. The stories of Dominic's mystical experiences suggest someone who'd achieved remarkable levels of contemplative awareness. Multiple witnesses testified to seeing him levitating during prayer, his body raised off the ground while he was lost in communion with God. Others reported seeing him surrounded by supernatural light or hearing angelic voices singing with him during his nocturnal vigils. He was known to experience ecstasies where he became completely unaware of his surroundings, absorbed in divine presence. Whether these accounts are literally accurate or symbolically embellished, and medieval hagiography freely mixed both modes. They point to something genuine. Dominic had direct experiential knowledge of divine reality that complemented and completed his theological and philosophical understanding. He didn't just know about God through arguments and doctrines. He knew God through direct encounter, through what mystics call union or communion. This experiential dimension transformed how Dominic understood and communicated Christian truth. When he preached about God's love, he wasn't repeating doctrines he'd learned from books. He was testifying to realities he'd encountered directly. When he spoke about the depths of human sin and the heights of divine mercy, he wasn't speculating philosophically, but reporting what he'd seen in contemplative vision. This gave his preaching an authority and power that mere intellectual brilliance could never provide. The integration of mystical experience with intellectual rigor was philosophically sophisticated. Dominic understood that mystical experience without theological framework was dangerous. It could lead to Illuminism, the belief that personal revelations trumped church teaching and scriptural authority. Many medieval heresies emerged from mystics who trusted their experiences uncritically and developed theologies at odds with orthodoxy. Dominic's deep grounding in scripture and theology provided a framework for interpreting his experiences correctly and discerning authentic mystical insights from illusions or diabolical deceptions. Conversely, Dominic understood that intellectual understanding without experiential dimension was sterile. You could construct logically perfect theological systems without ever encountering the God those systems described. You could win every argument without ever knowing the truth that transformed lives. The combination of intellectual rigor and mystical depth produced something greater than either alone. Wisdom that was both rationally sound and experientially verified, both theologically sophisticated and spiritually transformative. This integration reached its fullest expression in the vision that would become most associated with Dominic's legacy, the revelation of the Rosary. According to tradition, this happened around 1208, after years of preaching had produced disappointing results. The Albigensian heresy continued to spread despite Dominic's best efforts. Political and military developments were making the situation worse rather than better. Dominic was experiencing what later spiritual writers would call the Dark Night, a period when previous methods no longer worked, when God seemed absent, when everything felt futile. In this crisis, Dominic withdrew to the forest near Pruy for an extended period of prayer, fasting, and penance. For 3 days and nights, he prayed with extraordinary intensity, subjecting himself to severe disciplines, fasting completely, sleeping on the ground, even flagellating himself until blood flowed. This wasn't masochism, but a spiritual practice common in medieval Christianity, based on the conviction that the body needed to be brought into submission to the spirit, and that vicarious suffering could have redemptive value for others. According to tradition, on the third night, exhausted from prayer and mortification, Dominic had a vision of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She appeared surrounded by angels, radiating glory and maternal tenderness. But rather than commending his efforts or promising immediate success, she offered him something unexpected, a new method of prayer. Mary explained that the Albigensian heresy was rooted in forgetfulness of the Incarnation and the mysteries of Christ's life. The Cathars had developed abstract philosophical arguments about the evil of matter and the impossibility of divine involvement with material reality. What was needed wasn't just better counter-arguments, but a practice that would make the mysteries of the Incarnation concrete and imaginatively real for ordinary people. She then taught him the Rosary, a method of prayer that combined vocal recitation of familiar prayers, the Our Father and Hail Mary, with meditative contemplation on 15 mysteries drawn from the lives of Jesus and Mary. 5 joyful mysteries: Annunciation, Visitation, Nativity, Presentation, Finding in the Temple. 5 sorrowful mysteries: Agony in the Garden, Scourging, Crowning with Thorns, Carrying the Cross, Crucifixion. And 5 glorious mysteries: Resurrection, Ascension, Pentecost, Assumption, Coronation of Mary. The philosophical and pedagogical sophistication of the Rosary becomes apparent when you understand what Dominic was doing with this practice. He was creating a method that engaged different aspects of human consciousness simultaneously in service of a single goal: interiorizing the central truths of Christianity. The vocal recitation of the Our Father and Hail Mary occupied the discursive mind, providing a rhythmic structure that prevented distraction while anchoring the practice in scripture and traditional prayer. These weren't arbitrary formulas, but prayers with deep biblical and theological content. The Our Father taught proper relationship with God and others, right priorities, dependence on divine provision, and the necessity of forgiveness. The Hail Mary celebrated the Incarnation and asked for Mary's intercession. The meditative contemplation on the mysteries engaged the imagination and the intellect, helping practitioners visualize and understand the key events of salvation history. You weren't just thinking about abstract doctrines, but imaginatively entering into concrete gospel scenes, seeing Mary receive the angel's message, watching Jesus carry his cross, witnessing the resurrection. This imaginative engagement made the truths emotionally real and personally relevant in ways that abstract propositions couldn't achieve. The repetitive nature of the prayer created conditions for deeper contemplative states. The rhythm of repeated prayers, the tactile sensation of moving through the beads, the focused attention on the mysteries, all of this could, with practice, quiet discursive thought and create space for direct awareness, for the contemplative knowing that transcended concepts and images. And the whole practice was structured around the mysteries of Christ, systematically forming practitioners in orthodox doctrine through habitual meditation. By praying the Rosary regularly, people would internalize the central truths of Christianity: the Incarnation, the redemptive value of Christ's suffering, the resurrection, the sending of the Spirit, the glorification of redeemed humanity, not just as abstract doctrines, but as lived realities that shape their imagination and their understanding of existence. This was adult education through contemplative practice, genius in its simplicity and profundity. People who couldn't read Latin theological texts, who lacked access to formal education, who didn't have time for extended study, they could pray the Rosary. And through this practice, they would develop theological sophistication, doctrinal orthodoxy, imaginative familiarity with Scripture, and even contemplative depth, all simultaneously. The Rosary was a complete pedagogical method disguised as a simple devotional practice. Moreover, the Rosary directly countered the Albigensian errors. The joyful mysteries celebrated the Incarnation, God taking flesh, matter becoming the vehicle of grace, physical conception and birth being the means of salvation. The sorrowful mysteries emphasized Christ's physical suffering, real pain in a real body, matter involved in redemption, not just abstract spiritual realities. The glorious mysteries affirm the resurrection of the body and the assumption of Mary, bodily existence transfigured and glorified, not escaped or discarded. The entire structure of the Rosary was implicitly anti-cathar, teaching through meditation and repetition what hours of debate might not achieve. Part 5. The Philosophy of the Order. When Dominic founded the Order of Preachers in 1215-1216, he was institutionalizing a philosophical vision. The structures, rules, and practices he established weren't arbitrary organizational decisions, but reflected deep convictions about human nature, the pursuit of truth, the means of effective evangelization, and the transformation of society. Understanding the order's distinctive features reveals the philosophical depth of Dominic's achievement. The first distinctive feature was the order's commitment to study as an essential part of religious life and a primary occupation of the friars. Previous monastic orders had emphasized liturgical prayer, manual labor, and ascetic practices. The Benedictines, following their founder's rule, prayed the divine office, worked in their fields and scriptoria, and maintained a balance between ora et labora, prayer and work. The Cistercians sought God through liturgical devotion and agricultural labor in remote locations, deliberately avoiding intellectual pursuits as potential sources of pride and distraction. The Carthusians pursued extreme eremitical solitude, with individual monks living in separate cells and coming together only for limited liturgical celebrations. Dominic did something revolutionary within this monastic context. He made intellectual formation the primary occupation of his friars, subordinating even liturgical obligations when necessary. The Dominican constitutions explicitly stated that study could excuse a friar from attending the canonical hours, a shocking provision that revealed how seriously Dominic took the intellectual dimension of the order's mission. Friars were expected to attend the major liturgical celebrations, particularly Mass and Vespers, but could be dispensed from the others if study required it. Why was study so central? Because Dominic understood that the crisis facing the Church was fundamentally intellectual. Heresies weren't just moral failures or emotional rebellions against Church authority. They were mistakes in thinking, errors in reasoning, failures to understand the implications of Christian doctrine, or to see the logical problems in alternative systems. The Cathars had sophisticated philosophical arguments. The Waldensians raised challenging questions about church wealth and authority. Various other movements appealed to Scripture and reason in support of positions contrary to Catholic teaching. You couldn't combat intellectual error without intellectual weapons. You needed preachers who could think as rigorously as the heretics, who could spot logical fallacies and invalid inferences, who could construct compelling arguments and present them persuasively, who could explain difficult doctrines clearly and defend them against objections. This required serious, sustained intellectual formation, not just reading a few books, but mastering philosophy, theology, scripture, logic, and rhetoric through years of disciplined study. The Dominican houses of studies that developed over the first generation after Dominic's death reflected this commitment. The order established a hierarchical system of educational institutions. At the most basic level, each priory had a lectorate where young friars received initial formation in Latin grammar, logic, and fundamental theology. Promising students were then sent to studia for more advanced work in philosophy. The best of these would go to Studia Generalia in major university cities for specialized study in theology. And the most gifted would be sent to Paris or other major universities to earn doctorates and become masters capable of teaching at the highest level. This investment in education was enormous and reflected philosophical convictions about the nature of faith and reason. Dominic believed that Christian faith was supremely reasonable. Not that it could be proven by reason alone without revelation, but that it made philosophical sense, that it provided better answers to ultimate questions than any alternative worldview, that it could be shown to be coherent, plausible, and supported by both rational argument and experiential evidence. But demonstrating this reasonableness required sophisticated intellectual training. The Dominican educational system produced remarkable results. Within a generation, Dominicans held theological chairs at the University of Paris, the intellectual center of Western Christendom. Albert the Great, joining the order around 1223, would become one of medieval Europe's most learned scholars, making pioneering contributions to natural philosophy, theology, and biblical exegesis. His student Thomas Aquinas would produce the most influential synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy in Western history, demonstrating how Greek philosophical methods could be used to articulate and defend Christian truth. The Summa Theologiae remains a masterpiece of systematic thought, showing how rigorous reasoning could penetrate divine mysteries without compromising either reason's integrity or faith's transcendence. This emphasis on study reflected not just pragmatic necessity, but theological conviction. Dominic understood, following Augustine and other church fathers, that all truth is God's truth. There's no genuine conflict between faith and reason because both come from the same divine source. Philosophy pursued honestly would never contradict revealed truth, though it might reach limits beyond which only revelation could carry human understanding. And theology that incorporated philosophical rigor would be stronger, clearer, more persuasive than theology that ignored or opposed reason. The second distinctive feature of the order was its structure of democratic governance. Unlike previous religious orders, where abbots held power for life and exercised fairly absolute authority within their communities, Dominic established a system of elected leadership with limited terms, regular chapters where major decisions were made communally, and built-in checks and balances that prevented any individual from wielding unchecked power. The basic structure was elegant. Each priory was led by a prior elected by the community for a renewable 3-year term. Groups of priories formed provinces, each led by a provincial prior, elected by a provincial chapter, comprising elected representatives from the various priories. The entire order was led by a master general, elected by a general chapter, and serving for life, but subject to removal by the chapter if necessary. Major decisions about the order's direction, the admission of new constitutions, the establishment of new provinces, all were made in these chapters through processes of deliberation and voting. This democratic structure was unprecedented in religious life and remarkably innovative for the 13th century, when most governance structures were hierarchical and authority was understood to flow downward from God through established superiors. What philosophical convictions led Dominic to this innovation? First, it reflected his understanding of the relationship between authority and truth. Authority in the church isn't arbitrary, but is meant to serve truth. Leaders don't determine what's true by fiat. They're responsible for helping the community discover and serve truth. If authority exists to serve truth rather than to replace the search for truth, then authority must be accountable, limited, and exercised in dialogue with those being led. Second, it reflected confidence in the Holy Spirit's guidance of the community as a whole, not just its leaders. If the Spirit was working throughout the body of Christ, then wisdom would emerge from communal discernment rather than being concentrated in a single individual. Multiple perspectives would help correct individual biases and blind spots. The community together was more likely to reach truth than even the wisest individual working alone. Third, it reflected recognition that people are more committed to decisions they've participated in making. If friars were simply commanded to do things without understanding or input, they'd obey from duty, but without interior ownership. But if they'd participated in the discernment process, even when the final decision went against their personal preference, they'd understand the reasoning and feel invested in the outcome. Fourth, it reflected humility about human fallibility. Even the best leaders make mistakes. Even the wisest people can be wrong. Building in accountability and regular opportunities to change leadership reduced the damage that could be done by a misguided superior and created space for correcting errors. This philosophy of distributed wisdom and communal discernment was sophisticated for its time and anticipated modern democratic theory by centuries. It wasn't democracy in the modern sense. The order remained hierarchical in many ways, with superiors exercising real authority. But it was governance that took seriously the intelligence and spiritual maturity of the governed, that recognized limits on authority, and that created space for dissent, deliberation, and change. The third distinctive feature was what became the Dominican motto, contemplata aliis tradere, to hand on to others the fruits of contemplation. This phrase encapsulated Dominic's philosophical vision of the relationship between contemplation and action, between interior life and external ministry, between personal sanctification and apostolic effectiveness. The motto acknowledges that genuine preaching must emerge from contemplation. You can't give what you don't have. You can't effectively communicate truth you haven't personally encountered and interiorized. Before you can preach, you must pray. Before you can teach others, you must have been taught by God. Before you can guide souls, you must have walked the path of interior transformation yourself. This is why Dominican life balanced study and prayer, intellectual work and liturgical celebration, active ministry and contemplative retreat. But the motto also insists that contemplation without sharing is incomplete or defective. You don't contemplate just for your own spiritual benefit or perfection. You contemplate in order to communicate what you've discovered to others. The Dominican isn't a pure contemplative withdrawing from the world into prayer, nor is he a pure activist consumed by external work without interior depth. He's contemplative precisely in order to be active, and active precisely in order to share what contemplation has revealed. This integration reflects sophisticated understanding of human fulfillment and divine purpose. From a Christian perspective, human beings are created for communion with God and with each other. The two great commandments are to love God with all your being and to love your neighbor as yourself. These aren't separate or competing obligations, but complementary dimensions of a single reality. You love God most fully when your love overflows in service to those God loves. You serve others most effectively when your service flows from intimate communion with God. The contemplative dimension ensures that ministry doesn't become mere activism, that you're giving from abundance rather than emptiness, that what you offer is truth encountered personally rather than secondhand information. The active dimension ensures that contemplation doesn't become self-absorbed, that prayer leads to compassionate engagement with human need, that personal holiness serves the common good rather than stopping with individual perfection. This balance proved immensely fruitful. Dominicans became effective preachers precisely because their preaching emerged from prayer. They became influential theologians because their theology grew from contemplative encounter with divine mystery. They could engage secular learning and culture without being corrupted by it because they maintained regular contemplative practice that kept them rooted in God. The integration made them effective in ways that either pure contemplation or pure activism alone couldn't achieve. Part 6. Truth and Mercy United. Perhaps the most distinctive and philosophically significant aspect of Dominic's vision was his integration of truth and mercy. This integration might seem unproblematic initially. Of course, truth and mercy should go together. Of course, we should be both truthful and merciful. But historically and philosophically, they've often been experienced as competing values, requiring difficult trade-offs and painful compromises. The tension appears in various forms throughout intellectual and spiritual traditions. If you're committed to truth, don't you have to be uncompromising, rejecting error firmly wherever you find it, insisting on precision and accuracy even when it's uncomfortable, perhaps being harsh with those who deny or distort truth? After all, tolerating error seems like betrayal of truth. And if the stakes are eternal, if error leads to damnation, then isn't any compromise an uncharitable abandonment of those who need correction? But if you're committed to mercy, don't you have to be patient with weakness, tolerant of imperfection, willing to accommodate people's limitations and struggles? Don't you have to meet people where they are, accepting their pace of growth, perhaps overlooking errors if addressing them would cause unnecessary pain or drive people away? After all, harsh insistence on perfect correctness can destroy souls rather than saving them. Dominic's response to this tension was lived rather than merely theorized. His contemporaries consistently described him as combining doctrinal firmness with personal gentleness in ways that seemed almost paradoxical. He would debate Albigensian leaders all day with logical rigor and philosophical precision, never compromising truth or accepting sloppy reasoning, pointing out every fallacy and invalid inference, defending Catholic doctrine without any qualification or softening. His intellectual combat was intense and unsparing. But then, after hours of rigorous debate, he would weep for these same people he'd just refuted. He'd spend the night in prayer specifically for their conversion, asking God to have mercy on them, offering his own sufferings and prayers as intercession for their salvation. He'd show them personal kindness and respect, even while firmly rejecting their errors, treating them as brothers gone astray rather than as enemies to be destroyed. He'd invite them to meals, engage in friendly conversation about non-theological matters, demonstrate genuine care for their well-being. This combination wasn't inconsistent or hypocritical. It reflected sophisticated understanding of what truth and mercy actually mean and how they relate. Truth, properly understood, is mercy, because truth liberates. Jesus said, "The truth will set you free." And Dominic believed this absolutely. Error enslaves people in false consciousness, distorted relationships, destructive behaviors, and ultimately in separation from God. To offer truth to someone, even difficult truth they don't want to hear, is an act of love and mercy. The most merciful thing you can do for someone trapped in error is to help them see it clearly and offer them the truth that can free them. But here's the subtle part. Truth must be offered in a way that makes it receivable. You can have completely correct doctrine and completely valid arguments, but if you present them arrogantly, harshly, or without genuine love for the person you're addressing, they'll reject what you say. Not because it's false, but because of how you've said it. Truth offered without charity fails to accomplish its purpose because it fails to reach the person's heart. It might win the argument while losing the soul. This is why Dominic insisted that preachers must be formed in virtue as well as knowledge. You needed not just true doctrine, but also patience, kindness, humility, gentleness, self-control, the fruit of the Spirit that Paul enumerates. You needed to genuinely care about the people you were trying to reach, to want their good and not just your own vindication, to respect their dignity and intelligence even when you were convinced they were catastrophically wrong. Without this charity, even the most rigorous arguments would fail because they'd be perceived as attacks rather than invitations. Dominic's integration of truth and mercy also shaped his understanding of penance, conversion, and the treatment of those who'd been in error. When Albigensians converted to Catholicism through his preaching, Dominic didn't impose harsh penances to punish their past errors or treat them as second-class Christians who needed to prove themselves worthy of acceptance. He welcomed them with joy, assumed their sincerity, and immediately gave them responsibility and honor in the community. Some former Cathars became leaders in the Catholic revival of Languedoc, their intimate knowledge of heretical arguments making them particularly effective advocates for orthodoxy. This merciful approach wasn't laxity or indifference to the seriousness of heresy. It was confidence in God's transforming power. If someone had genuinely encountered truth and been converted by it, God would continue the work of transformation in them. You didn't need to load them down with burdens or treat them suspiciously. You needed to welcome them into the community where truth was lived and celebrated, trusting that their ongoing participation in that community would complete what God had begun. This same integration of truth and mercy appeared in Dominic's response to the Albigensian Crusade. In 1208, after the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau was assassinated, allegedly by Cathar sympathizers, Pope Innocent III called for a crusade against the heretics. Northern French nobles, attracted by the opportunity to seize lands in the wealthy south, responded enthusiastically. For 2 decades, Languedoc was devastated by brutal warfare that killed thousands and destroyed the distinctive culture of the region. Dominic was in Languedoc throughout much of this period, but his position on the crusade was complex and sometimes uncomfortable. He didn't support the military campaign, continuing to advocate peaceful persuasion rather than coercion. He reportedly wept when he heard about massacres and atrocities committed by crusading forces. He sheltered refugees from the fighting, regardless of their religious affiliation. He tried to moderate the vengeful impulses of victorious Catholics who wanted harsh punishment for defeated heretics. Yet he also maintained relationships with crusade leaders, preached to crusading forces, and, accepted that some Catholics saw military action as necessary to protect the faithful from heretical violence. This wasn't moral compromise, but recognition of complexity. Dominic distinguished between the legitimate goal of protecting Catholic populations and the illegitimate means of forced conversion. He insisted that violence might defend against violence, but couldn't create genuine faith. You could stop heretics from actively persecuting Catholics, but you couldn't make them believe truth through force. This position anticipated later Catholic teaching on religious freedom. While medieval Christendom generally accepted that Christian rulers could suppress heresy through force, and while it would take centuries for the Church to fully embrace religious freedom, Dominic's insistence that genuine faith requires free assent planted seeds that would eventually flower in Vatican II's Declaration on Religious Freedom. Truth has its own authority and doesn't need the crutch of coercion. In fact, resorting to force suggests weakness, that you don't have good enough arguments, that you're afraid of open debate, that your position can't withstand scrutiny. The philosophical sophistication of Dominic's position becomes apparent when we compare it with other responses to religious difference in his time and later periods. Many of his contemporaries assumed that unity of faith required uniformity of belief enforced through whatever means necessary, including violence. The alternative seemed to be relativism or indifferentism, the position that all beliefs are equally valid or that truth doesn't matter. Dominic saw a third way: passionate commitment to truth combined with respect for persons and confidence that truth would prevail through persuasion rather than coercion. This third way required both intellectual confidence and moral courage. Intellectual confidence because you had to believe that truth was strong enough to win in fair debate, that good arguments would prove more compelling than bad ones, that people of goodwill would recognize truth when it was presented clearly. Moral courage because persuasion is slower and less certain than coercion, because you had to accept that some people would reject truth despite your best efforts, because you had to trust God's providence rather than taking control through force. Dominic's example showed that this third way was possible. His preaching did convert Cathars, not through force, but through the intrinsic power of truth embodied in authentic witness. The communities he established became centers of Catholic renewal in regions that had been deeply infected with heresy. The order he founded would continue this work of peaceful evangelization for centuries, demonstrating that truth and mercy weren't competing values, but complementary realities that strengthened each other. Part 7. The Social Vision. Dominic's philosophy extended beyond individual transformation to social renewal and cultural engagement. He understood that personal sanctity and social structures were interconnected, that the Church's mission included not just saving individual souls, but transforming social patterns and cultural assumptions. His social vision emerged organically from his core philosophical commitments and found expression in various dimensions of his ministry. The most obvious expression was his concern for material poverty and its victims. Dominic's charity wasn't occasional almsgiving, but systematic engagement with human need. The story of selling his books to feed the hungry during the famine at Palencia wasn't an isolated incident, but revealed a fundamental conviction. Material goods exist to serve human need, and when people are suffering, ordinary rules about property rights can and should be suspended. This conviction anticipated later Catholic social teaching about the universal destination of goods, the principle that while private property is legitimate and even necessary for human flourishing, it must serve the common good. In extreme cases, when people face starvation or death, they have a right to what they need for survival, and those who possess abundance have an obligation to provide it. Property rights aren't absolute, but are subordinate to the more fundamental right to life. Dominic applied this principle rigorously in his own life and in the communities he founded. The Dominican rule emphasized evangelical poverty, not the extreme destitution practiced by some medieval movements, but a genuine simplicity that freed friars from material concerns and identified them with the poor they served. Dominicans weren't to own property individually. Their communities would own only what was necessary for their mission. They'd work to support themselves, but also accept alms, and they'd distribute whatever excess they had to those in greater need. This wasn't romanticization of poverty. Dominic knew that material destitution damaged people, making intellectual and spiritual development difficult and creating vulnerabilities to exploitation. The goal wasn't poverty for its own sake, but appropriate simplicity that prevented wealth from becoming an idol or a distraction. The point was freedom, liberation from anxiety about material things, from the endless pursuit of more, from the status competitions that wealth facilitates. This freedom enabled friars to focus on their mission and to serve people across social classes without being compromised by financial interests. The ministry to converted Albigensian women represented another dimension of Dominic's social engagement. When women from Cathar families converted to Catholicism, they faced enormous practical difficulties. In medieval society, respectable options for women were extremely limited. Marriage, which was now impossible if their families had disowned them for converting. Entering a convent, if one would accept them and they had the required dowry. Or dependence on male relatives, charity. Women without family support or means often fell into prostitution or desperate poverty. Dominic established the monastery at Pruy specifically to provide these women with a stable community where they could live with dignity, receive education, support themselves through productive work, and contribute to the church's mission through prayer. The monastery wasn't just charitable shelter, but a genuine religious community with its own charism and significance. The women there lived under rule, followed regular patterns of prayer and work, and understood their contemplative life as supporting the preaching mission of the friars. This attention to providing structural solutions to social problems, not just individual charity, was sophisticated. Dominic recognized that personal generosity, while essential and praiseworthy, couldn't solve systemic issues. You needed institutions, stable communities with resources, governance structures, and clear purposes that could provide ongoing support and create alternatives to problematic social arrangements. The monastery at Pruy was such an institution, and its success led to the establishment of many similar communities throughout Europe. Dominic's social vision also included strategic positioning of his communities in centers of cultural influence. The decision to establish Dominican houses in major university cities, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Cambridge, reflected understanding that universities were the nerve centers of medieval culture. These were the institutions where future leaders were formed, where intellectual trends that would shape society were developing, where the church could engage emerging ideas rather than merely reacting to established heresies. By establishing communities of well-educated friars in these locations, Dominic was positioning the order to influence culture at its source. Dominicans wouldn't just respond reactively to problems after they'd already metastasized. They'd be present in the intellectual conversation as it unfolded, offering Catholic perspectives on emerging questions, engaging new ideas as they developed, forming students who'd carry Dominican influence into various domains of society. This strategy proved remarkably effective. Within a generation, Dominicans held theological chairs at major universities. They produced some of the most influential thinkers of the medieval period: Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, Robert Kilwardby, and many others, who synthesized classical philosophy with Christian theology, responded to the challenge of newly available Aristotelian texts, and developed intellectual frameworks that would shape Western thought for centuries. The influence extended beyond theology. Dominicans made contributions to natural philosophy, astronomy, medicine, law, and political theory. They demonstrated that Catholic Christianity wasn't hostile to secular learning, but could integrate and transcend it, showing how natural knowledge and revealed truth complemented rather than contradicted each other. This engagement with secular culture from a position of intellectual confidence rather than defensive reaction became a hallmark of Dominican influence. Dominic's social philosophy also included sophisticated understanding of cultural engagement and adaptation. He didn't advocate Christian withdrawal from secular culture or the imposition of theocracy. Rather, he modeled a dialogical approach where Christians engaged culture seriously, learned from it where appropriate, and offered Christian perspectives in terms culture could understand. His method of debate with the Albigensians exemplified this, meeting them on their own intellectual terms, showing respect for their arguments even while refuting them, demonstrating that Christianity could hold its own in open, rational discussion. This cultural engagement required what we'd now call inculturation, the ability to express Christian truth in categories and language accessible to particular cultural contexts. Dominic did this in southern France by adopting some elements of troubadour culture, using story and song to communicate theological truths in ways that resonated with local sensibilities. He encouraged his friars to master the languages and customs of the regions where they preached. He insisted on meeting people where they were culturally and intellectually, rather than demanding that they first adopt clerical culture before hearing the gospel. Later, Dominicans would do similar work in other contexts. Raymond of Peñafort would compile the decretals, organizing canon law in ways that made it accessible and applicable. Vincent of Beauvais would compile the Speculum Maius, attempting to encompass all human knowledge in a single encyclopedic work. Bartolomé de las Casas would defend indigenous peoples in the Americas, arguing that they had full human dignity and cultures worth respecting rather than simply destroying. Thomas Aquinas would synthesize Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology, showing how pagan philosophy could be integrated with revealed truth. All of this flowed from Dominic's fundamental conviction that truth wasn't threatened by cultural diversity or intellectual plurality. Different cultures and intellectual traditions could contribute genuine insights. The Church's mission wasn't to destroy these, but to purify and perfect them, to show how they pointed toward truths more fully revealed in Christ, to integrate what was valuable while correcting what was false. Part 8. The Final Synthesis. The final years of Dominic's life brought both triumph and trial. By 1220, the order of preachers had grown far beyond what anyone could have predicted. What began in 1215 with 16 men now numbered several hundred friars in dozens of communities across Europe. Dominican houses had been established in Spain, France, Italy, and even distant regions like Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. The order had been granted special privileges by the papacy, recognizing its unique mission and exempting it from some local ecclesiastical jurisdiction. But this rapid growth created enormous challenges. How do you maintain the distinctive charism and high standards when communities are multiplying and many new members have received only minimal formation? How do you preserve unity of purpose across diverse cultures and languages? How do you balance the need for structure and governance with the flexibility required for a missionary order? How do you prevent the order from becoming just another establishment institution, losing the evangelical poverty and apostolic zeal that had animated its founding? Dominic addressed these challenges through 2 general chapters held in Bologna in 1220 and 1221. These gatherings brought together representatives from all the Dominican provinces to deliberate about the order's direction, to establish uniform practices, and to elect leadership. The chapters demonstrated Dominic's governance philosophy in action: serious discussion of difficult issues, openness to multiple perspectives, collective discernment culminating in decisions that all would then be obligated to follow. At the 1220 chapter, one of the most significant decisions concerned the order's relationship to property and stability. Some friars argued that the order should accept endowments and stable income sources, allowing communities to focus on study and preaching without constant worry about material support. This was how most religious orders operated. They owned lands, collected rents, and had guaranteed income. Dominic firmly opposed this proposal. He insisted that the order maintain evangelical poverty, not owning property beyond what was immediately necessary, supporting itself through alms and the friars' work, remaining always dependent on providence. His reasoning was both theological and practical. Theologically, poverty was freedom, liberation from anxiety about possessions, from the constant management that wealth requires, from the temptation to compromise principles for financial security. Practically, poverty maintained credibility. How could they preach about detachment while accumulating wealth? How could they challenge others' materialism while securing their own comfort? The chapter accepted Dominic's position, enshrining evangelical poverty as central to Dominican identity. But Dominic went further, doing something shocking that demonstrated his complete commitment to this principle. The order owned a few houses in Bologna that provided some rental income. After the chapter decided to maintain poverty, Dominic immediately gave these properties away to the Poor Clares, a women's Franciscan community. The friars were stunned. That was their security, their backup plan if alms dried up. Dominic's response was simple: God will provide. This radical trust in providence wasn't naive optimism, but theological conviction. If the order was truly doing God's work, God would ensure it had what it needed. If God stopped providing, that would be a sign to change direction. Better to depend directly on God than to insulate yourself from divine guidance through accumulated wealth. The decision preserved Dominican freedom and credibility for centuries. At the same 12 and 20 chapter, Dominic made another momentous decision. He dispersed his friars far beyond where they'd already spread. Rather than consolidating in regions where they were established, he sent them to new territories: Germany, Hungary, Scandinavia, Poland, England. Some friars protested. These were dangerous missions to unfamiliar lands where they didn't know the language or customs, where they might face persecution. Better to strengthen existing communities before expanding further. But Dominic saw the church's need was urgent, and the opportunity wouldn't last. The universities were just emerging as major cultural forces. If Dominicans weren't present as these institutions developed, others would occupy that space, and the chance to influence Christian intellectual culture would be lost. The missionary imperative outweighed the comfort of consolidation. Go and preach, for this is what we've been called to do, Dominic told them as he sent them off, often with tears, knowing he'd likely never see many of them again. This willingness to disperse his limited forces rather than concentrating them revealed Dominic's strategic vision. He wasn't building an institution to preserve itself, but a missionary movement to transform culture. Institutions seek security and consolidation. Movements accept risk and dispersion in service of their mission. Dominic's decisions ensured that the Dominicans would remain fundamentally missionary rather than becoming comfortably institutional. By 1221, Dominic was only 50, but physically exhausted. Years of constant travel on foot, insufficient food and sleep, harsh ascetic practices, and the psychological stress of building a new religious order from nothing had taken their toll. He suffered from persistent fevers, digestive problems that made it difficult to eat or keep food down, severe headaches, and the general debilitation that comes from prolonged physical privation. His body was giving out. Yet he continued traveling, preaching, and working for the order's expansion, even as his health failed. He presided over the second general chapter in Bologna in May 1221, where the order was reorganized into 8 provinces with clear governance structures. He continued visiting communities, encouraging friars, resolving disputes, and maintaining the vision that animated the whole enterprise. Those who saw him during this period were struck by the contrast between his physical weakness and his spiritual vitality. His body was failing, but his spirit was undimmed. That summer, the fevers intensified. Dominic knew death was approaching. He requested to be taken to the Dominican convent in Bologna. "Let me die at my brother's feet," he said, asking humbly to end his life among the community he'd founded, rather than in some more dignified setting. Once back at the convent, he gathered the friars around his bed and gave his final instructions. Have charity, preserve humility, keep voluntary poverty. These 3 virtues, he insisted, were the foundation of everything. With them, the order would flourish, regardless of external circumstances. Without them, no amount of learning, no institutional structures, no legal privileges would preserve the Dominican charism. Charity, the love that seeks others' genuine good, that wants their salvation and flourishing more than your own comfort or success, that makes you willing to spend yourself completely in service. Without charity, study becomes pride, preaching becomes performance, and community becomes competition. Humility, the realism that acknowledges your own limitations and God's primacy, that doesn't claim credit for what God accomplishes through you. That makes you teachable and open to correction. Without humility, you stop growing because you think you've arrived. You can't work with others because you always need to be right. And you can't serve effectively because it's really about you rather than about those you're supposedly serving. Poverty, the freedom from attachment to material things that liberates you to pursue what truly matters, that demonstrates trust in divine providence, and that identifies you with Christ, who had nowhere to lay his head. Without poverty, you become enslaved to maintaining what you've acquired, afraid to risk anything that might threaten your security, compromised in your witness by the need to protect your financial interests. These three virtues summarized everything Dominic believed about the Christian life and Dominican vocation. Notice what he didn't emphasize in his final words. He didn't stress intellectual achievement or successful debates or institutional expansion. He didn't mention the miracles attributed to him or the influential people he'd influenced. He focused on character, the interior qualities that made everything else possible and meaningful. Dominic died on August 6, 1221, the Feast of the Transfiguration, a liturgical coincidence that seemed symbolically appropriate. Just as Christ was transfigured on the mountain, revealing the glory hidden in his ordinary human appearance, Dominic's life was being transfigured through death, moving from earthly labor to heavenly reward. The friars who witnessed his death reported supernatural peace and even joy in his final moments, suggesting someone who'd lived so deeply into truth that death held no terror but appeared as gateway to fuller life. The miracles reported at his tomb, healings, conversions, supernatural fragrances, appearances in dreams to guide people, were interpreted as divine confirmation of his sanctity. But the real miracle was the legacy he'd established, a philosophical vision and practical method that would shape Christian thought and practice for centuries, demonstrating how faith and reason, contemplation and action, truth and mercy, personal holiness and social transformation could be integrated in fully human life ordered toward the divine. Conclusion, the enduring vision. And so we come to the end of our journey through Saint Dominic's philosophy. We've traveled from his birth in medieval Castile through his intellectual formation at Palencia, his years in the cathedral chapter at Osma, his transformative encounter with the Albigensian heresy, the founding of the Order of Preachers, the revelation of the Rosary, and his final years establishing the order's structures before his death at 50. Throughout this exploration, we've seen how Dominic developed and lived a comprehensive philosophical vision that integrated dimensions of existence that are often fragmented: faith and reason, contemplation and action, truth and mercy, personal sanctity and social transformation, intellectual rigor and mystical depth. The enduring significance of Dominic's philosophy lies not in providing ready-made answers to 21st century problems, but in modeling an approach to the perennial human questions that remains valid across changing circumstances. The fundamental principles he articulated and embodied transcend their medieval context because they address permanent features of human nature and the structure of reality itself. The conviction that truth exists and can be known, that it's worth pursuing with complete dedication of mind and heart, that it liberates rather than constraining, that it demands both intellectual rigor and lived witness. These commitments remain as necessary and challenging today as they were 8 centuries ago. In an age of epistemological skepticism, where many doubt whether truth exists or whether we can know it if it does, Dominic's confident pursuit of truth offers an alternative to both dogmatic fundamentalism and relativistic despair. The integration of faith and reason that Dominic modeled and that his order developed through figures like Thomas Aquinas remains philosophically compelling. You don't have to choose between intellectual honesty and religious commitment, between academic rigor and spiritual devotion, between respecting secular learning and maintaining faith. The synthesis is possible because truth is ultimately one, and different paths of investigation converge on the same reality when pursued honestly and completely. The balance between contemplation and action that Dominic encapsulated in Contemplata Tradere addresses a perennial human struggle. We oscillate between escapist withdrawal and frenzied activism, between pure interiority and pure exteriority, never quite finding the integration that makes life coherent. Dominic showed that you don't contemplate instead of acting or act instead of contemplating. You contemplate in order to act from depth rather than shallowness, and you act in order to share what contemplation has revealed. Each dimension completes and perfects the other. The unity of truth and mercy that Dominic embodied challenges both our contemporary polarizations and our perennial tendencies. We want to be either prophets thundering truth regardless of consequences, or pastors showing mercy regardless of truth. Dominic demonstrated that this is a false choice. Truth is mercy when offered with love, and mercy requires truth as its content. You can be both uncompromising about truth and gentle with persons, both intellectually rigorous and emotionally compassionate, both firmly committed to right doctrine and respectfully engaged with those who disagree. The social vision that informed Dominic's decisions and that his order developed over centuries remains relevant to questions about faith's relationship to culture, the Church's social mission, and the integration of personal holiness with structural reform. We need both individual conversion and social transformation. We need both contemplative communities and active engagement with the world's problems. We need both preservation of tradition and creative adaptation to new circumstances. Perhaps most importantly for our contemporary situation, Dominic's life and thought demonstrate the possibility of holding together things that our culture tends to fragment. We're told we must choose between reason and faith, between tradition and innovation, between community and individuality, between truth and dialogue, between personal holiness and social justice. Dominic's example suggests these are false choices rooted in shallow, either-or thinking. The integration is possible, though difficult and demanding. It requires the kind of holistic formation, sustained intellectual work, deep spiritual practice, and authentic community that Dominic established in the Order of Preachers. The philosophical vision Dominic articulated 8 centuries ago speaks powerfully to contemporary challenges precisely because it addresses perennial human needs and realities. The hunger for truth, the need for meaning, the desire for community, the longing for transcendence, the struggle to integrate different dimensions of existence. These are constants of human experience. Dominic's synthesis offers not formulaic answers, but a proven approach, a tested wisdom, a demonstrated possibility of living fully and coherently in the midst of complexity and challenge. May we learn from this remarkable saint, this preacher of truth, this founder of an intellectual and spiritual tradition that has enriched church and world. May we pursue truth with his passion, integrate faith and reason with his confidence, balance contemplation and action with his wisdom, unite truth and mercy in our engagements, and serve the common good with his zeal. And may we remember that philosophy isn't abstract speculation. but practical wisdom for living fully human, fully Christian lives in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. Rest now in these reflections. Let them settle into your consciousness as you drift towards sleep. Perhaps tomorrow, you'll look at truth differently. See the integration of contemplation and action not as impossible ideal, but as achievable wisdom. Understand that rigorous thought and deep prayer, intellectual work and practical service aren't competing alternatives, but complementary dimensions of full human flourishing. Perhaps you'll hear in Dominic's life a call to your own integration, your own pursuit of truth embodied in love, your own balance of interior depth and exterior engagement. Sleep well, and may the truth that Dominic served with mind and heart guide you toward wisdom, compassion, and that integration of all good things in divine love that is our ultimate destiny and deepest fulfillment. Good night.